Well, greetings, everybody, and welcome to City Lights Live, the online presence of City Lights booksellers and publishers online event calendar. I am your host, Peter Maravellis. Today's event is co-sponsored by our friends at PEN America. Our program is called From Howl to Now, Book Bans in the U.S. It is part of the Banned Book Weeks events taking place all over the country. City Lights and PEN America bring together human rights advocates and legal experts to discuss the alarming rise in book bans across the country. They share insights, observations, and methods to counter the suppression of books that addresses issues pertaining to race, gender, and sexuality. Today's discussion is more than an assessment of a very dire political climate. It is a powerful call to action to stand up for the freedom to read. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Ramaytush peoples. We would like to take this moment to offer our respect to those who have come before us as stewards of the land. The moderator for today's program will be Ipek Burnett, the co-chair of Human Rights Watch Executive Committee in San Francisco and also board member at 826 Valencia. She is a novelist, nonfiction writer, and editor. Her most recent book is titled A Jungian Inquiry into the American Psyche, the Violence of Innocence. She is also the editor of the collection titled Re-Visioning the American Psyche. Joining her will be Summer Lopez, PEN America's Chief Program Officer for Free Expression. She oversees PEN America's advocacy, research, and programming in defense of free expression in the U.S. and globally. Also joining us will be Ronald Collins, the co-founder and co-director emeritus of the History Book Festival and co-founder and co-chair of First Amendment Salons. He is the editor of the weekly online blog, First Amendment News. He is an author and educator. He is the Lewis Public Library's distinguished lecturer. Together with our other guest, David Skover, he is co-authored the book, The People versus Ferlinghetti, The Fight to Publish Allen Ginsberg's Howl. Also joining us will be David Skover. He is an author, educator, attorney, and former Frederick C. Toussaint Professor of Law at the Seattle University School of Law. He has taught, wrote, and lectured in the fields of federal constitutional law, federal courts, free speech, and the internet and mass communications theory. As mentioned previously, he also co-authored the book, The People versus Ferlinghetti. So also with us will be Trey. Trey is democracy researcher and advocate for Human Rights Watch's U.S. program. He documents and challenges threats to voting rights, access to truthful information, and civic engagement. He collaborates with movements working to promote robust multiracial democracy in the U.S. He's previously worked with Groundwork Project and served as project manager at Equal Justice Initiative. So we're going to be posting links in the chat function of Reduced Zoom dashboard with which you may learn more about the good work of PEN America and Human Rights Watch. We'll also be posting links with which you may purchase books by our program's authors. And we will be taking questions from the audience towards the end of the program. So post your questions and comments in that same chat function. So it is such a great honor to have such an esteemed group of participants here with us today. Welcome to you all. To get our program started, I would like to welcome now Ipek Burnett.
Thank you, Peter. And thank you, City Lights, for hosting today's event. I had the great privilege of moderating these conversations for the last few years, and they have been eye-opening, very informative, emboldening, and inspiring. And with today's very impressive panel, I'm delighted to welcome everyone. Before we dive into the panel discussion, I just want to take a moment and share a few words by the revolutionary poet Lawrence Ferlinghetti. I know we're going to be talking about him later on, so I thought it would be nice to start with him as well. So here is this little, quite little, but mighty book, Poetry as Insurgent Art. It's a gem. I highly recommend it. This book lives on my desk, doesn't go anywhere. So I'm going to share just a few lines from the very first page. He writes, I'm signaling you through the flames. The North Pole is not where it's used to be. Manifest destiny is no longer manifest. Civilization self-destructs. Nemesis is knocking at the door. What are poets for in such an age? What is the use of poetry? The state of the world calls out for poetry to save it, a voice in the wilderness. I love that because it's about the power of poetry, right? But to me, it's also about the power of literature and power of books, all books, because books are powerful. They open our minds, open our hearts, open our imaginations. They expand our view, expand our world through knowledge and nuance and empathy. And the state of the world right now, today, at least in the US, when it comes to book bans, is calling us all in, right? All the writers and poets and the readers and the teachers and librarians and activists and publishers, all of us, all the community members, to really protect books and celebrate also their power. And that's what Banned Books Week is really about. It is about celebrating the power of books and the freedom to read. And Banned Books Week has been happening since 1982, so for the past 42 years. And yet the flames are still raging. That self-destruction still continues. Every year we're witnessing more bans, more fights. So with that, I want to turn it over to Summer Lopez from PEN America, who has been joining us at these conversations since we began this event years ago. So Summer, it's wonderful to have you with us. Can you please tell us what is happening right now? What is PEN America uncovering and reporting on, the new threats, the new threat trends, and also the efforts to push back against the book bans?
Thank you so much, Ipek, and thank you, Peter, and to City Lights for hosting this event. I'm so happy to be here with everyone today as we kick off Banned Books Week. And as Ipek and Peter have heard me say in previous years, this event holds a special place in my heart because I grew up in Southern California, and my mom and I used to go to San Francisco on vacation, and we would go to City Lights bookstore, and I fell in love with it and with the world of stories that it contained. And it's that kind of access to books, to ideas, and to stories that's on the line today and that we're all here to defend. So thank you all for being here. For those who might not be familiar with PEN America, we're an organization that stands at the intersection of literature and human rights to celebrate the written word and to defend free expression in the US and around the globe. For more than 100 years, we've championed the freedom to write, recognizing the power of the word to transform the world. And of course, it goes without saying that book bans are nothing new in this country, and they've never gone away completely. PEN America has been fighting back against them as part of our work for decades, speaking out to ensure that books like The Bluest Eye, The Handmaid's Tale, Slaughterhouse-Five, To Kill a Mockingbird remain in classrooms and on library shelves. But for most of recent memory, we had traditionally been dealing with maybe a few cases of book bans a year. We started documenting this rise in book banning in schools in 2021. And at that time, few of us really could have imagined the degree to which a vocal minority would be able to drive forward a censorship crisis of this magnitude. But at no point in decades have we seen anything like what's been happening in the last few years. So for more than 3 years now, we've increasingly watched books disappearing from school library shelves, being challenged in droves, and being decreed off limits by school boards and legislators. And in the third consecutive year of this attack, this organized effort has commandeered school and library boards, city councils, state legislatures in an unprecedented effort to extend ideological control over public institutions and to ban books by any means necessary. And overwhelmingly, it continues to be the books, writers, and stories that have long fought for a place on the shelf that are being targeted. Books by and about people of color, LGBTQ+ people, and women, books about race, racism, gender, sexuality, and US history. And we continue at PEN to look at these book bans as part of a larger movement we've called the Ed Scare, a callback to the Red Scare, but a broad movement to exert ideological control over educational institutions that really began in 2021, January 2021, with a wave of legislative proposals that we've called educational gag orders, attempting to prohibit specific content related to race, gender, sexuality, and US history from classrooms and trainings. This swell of bills was part of a broad backlash that we saw against the racial reckoning that ensued in many institutions following on the publication of the 1619 Project and the murder of George Floyd. And it was quickly followed by a broader campaign of coordinated efforts to ban books from public school classrooms and libraries. So even as polls repeatedly show that a majority of Americans across political lines oppose book bans, the number of bans has increased from one school year to the next. This year, PEN America's preliminary documentation is showing a stunning increase in books removed from school classrooms and libraries during the 2023 to 2024 school year. We've documented over 10,000 instances of book bans, and we're still counting. This is nearly triple the number from the previous school year when PEN America had recorded 3,362 bans nationwide. Some 8,000 of the book bans during the last school year were recorded in Florida and Iowa alone, largely because of new state laws. But we've seen dramatic numbers of books banned in other school districts as well, such as in the Elkhorn Area School District in Wisconsin, which banned more than 300 titles for several months. And consistent with trends from previous years, books banned during the last school year overwhelmingly featured stories with people or characters of color and or LGBTQ+ people. We've also increasingly seen hyperbolic rhetoric about porn in schools being used to target books with any sexual content, often defined very broadly, and sweeping up books about sexual violence and abuse, about women's sexual experiences in general, and about LGBTQ+ stories, even when there's no actual sexual content at all. This is often accompanied by alarming attacks we've seen on librarians and educators, including labeling them as groomers. And in recent years, there are two really key pressures behind the school book ban movement: state legislation and the influence of groups that espouse so-called parental rights rhetoric to advance pro-censorship advocacy goals. Coordinated campaigns by individual actors and groups representing a vocal minority are placing extreme pressures on school boards and districts, resulting in a chilled atmosphere of overly cautious decision-making regarding the accessibility of books in public school libraries and classrooms. And I want to emphasize that while the term parental rights gets used a lot, it really means privileging the rights and preferences of some parents over others. It's always reasonable for parents to have a say in what their own children read and learn, but it's not okay for some parents to make decisions for everyone else's children. And this year, state legislation was also particularly critical in accelerating book bans, making it easier to remove books from schools without due process, or in some cases without any formal process whatsoever. So over a dozen new laws and state policies used to ban books in schools have been implemented, as have a number of district policies at the local level. Iowa's new law, SF 496, took effect in July 2023 and requires all materials to be age appropriate, a definition that prohibits any description or depiction of a sex act. The law has been interpreted to ban books with any content related to sex or gender. It also contains copycat provisions of Florida's Don't Say Gay law, which censors discussions of LGBTQ+ identities in the classroom. To date, we've seen this law lead to thousands of book bans during the 2023 to 2024 school year, compared to just 14 bans that we'd seen in Iowa during the previous 2 school years before the law was in place. And I know Trey will talk to us more about what's happening in Florida, where we also have an active lawsuit against Escambia County, but the state's HB 1069, which went into effect in July 2023, and state guidance that has followed it, has been linked to a significant rise in book bans during the last school year. This requires that any book challenged for sexual conduct must be removed during the review process, which, as we saw happen in Escambia even before that law was in place, means a single person can get a huge number of books banned just by submitting challenge forms about them and claiming they contain sexual content. Other newly enacted policies allowing for statewide book bans are likely to impact the coming school year as well. Utah banned 13 books statewide as of July 2024 in accordance with a newly enacted bill, HB 29, which we consider to be probably the most extreme state book banning bill currently in place. It's created what we've called a no-read list in schools across the state. So according to the letter of the law, once any 3 districts find a title to be objectively sensitive material, it must be banned in all schools across the state. The current list includes books including Forever by Judy Blume, Milk and Honey by Rupi Kaur, and Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood. And we've seen similar regulations to these enacted in both South Carolina and Tennessee this summer. So these are states where we really anticipate seeing a significant rise in book bans in the coming school year. Our final figures on banned books for the last school year by state and district, as well as a comprehensive analysis of the content of the banned books, will be released later in October, along with an updated version of our Index of School Book Bans, which is a searchable database of all instances of books banned by school district. But even as we've seen book bans cross this distressing threshold of more than 10,000 cases in the last school year, we also have to remember that our numbers are an undercount. Many stories of book bans go unreported, and they also don't capture the broader chilling effect that this movement is having on our schools. The many reports of soft censorship we hear by librarians and educators who are feeling a tremendous amount of pressure and even danger. This can take the form of being more hesitant in terms of the books they're selecting and purchasing, removing books from classroom collections, and cancellations of author visits and book fairs. We're seeing author visits to schools canceled or invitations decreasing, especially for writers of books with LGBTQ+ content or who are themselves LGBTQ+ or writers of color. We've seen campaigns to cancel scholastic book fairs because of the books they might carry. And I want to emphasize this movement is really largely about restricting access to a very specific set of books and stories. The books that represent the voices and stories of LGBTQ+ people and people of color, books that wrestle with the tough issues children themselves also have to wrestle with: race and racism, gender and sexuality, abuse and violence, and the complexities of history. And by doing so, the movement to ban books robs children of the opportunity to see themselves and their experiences reflected in the stories they read, and the opportunity to build empathy for people whose lives and experiences may be different from their own. That's the power of what literature does, and that's why reading is so critical for young people. School libraries serve the educational process by making that knowledge and ideas available and ensuring students have access to books regardless of their own restrictions, of their own sort of personal access. Book bans impede that freedom to read and limit students' access to a diversity of views and stories. And the movement itself is inherently undemocratic, inflicting restrictions on all students and families based on the preferences of a few, and banning books based on the ideas they contain. The right to free speech also encompasses the right to receive information, and our young people have that right as well. Access to a diversity of books, ideas, and stories is the basis of education in a democracy. Because in a democracy, ideas are not to be feared, but to be engaged with, considered, debated, challenged, sometimes fought back against, but not banned. So at PEN America, we're continuing to document and draw attention to the threats this campaign poses to the freedom to read, think, and learn. We sometimes get questions about whether the book banning is starting to die down, and this year's numbers make painfully clear that unfortunately the opposite is the case. But of course, I also want to acknowledge that there are many, many people out there who are fighting back. Parents, students, librarians, teachers, and activists are pushing back against book bans in their communities, and lawsuits have been brought against a number of these unjust laws. As just one example, this summer we joined with our partners in Florida to host the United Voices Summit with more than 350 educators, librarians, activists, writers, and community leaders from around the state who gathered to mobilize against educational censorship. But book bans are happening in almost every state. They're definitely in California too. This is a California-centric event. So it's on all of us to fight back. We hope you will join us in that fight, and you can find out more about what you can do at pen.org/bookbans. Thank you so much.
Summer, thank you so much. As always, your overview is incredibly rich and insightful. And like you said, and I know we talked about this at last year's events too, it really boils down to this is about democracy, right? Whose voices get heard and whose voices get silenced, whose stories, perspectives, voices are welcomed and included, and whose are marginalized and rejected, repressed. And in that sense, this is also about human rights. So we're talking about the intersection of human rights and democracy. So I'm thrilled to have Trey here with us today because as a researcher and advocate at Human Rights Watch's democracy program, this is exactly his wheelhouse. He works in this intersection of human rights and democracy. So Trey, welcome. It's such a pleasure to have you. Can you tell us about your work in that intersection, that very important intersection, and also in particular, your work in Florida, given that Florida has more book bans than any other state in the country?
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thanks, Ipek. It's good to be here, everybody. My name is Trey Walk. And I just want to start just by telling you a little bit about myself, because I think it gives you an entryway into how I'm thinking about this work that we're up to at Human Rights Watch. So I have a really personal connection to this issue. I grew up in a really small town in the upstate of South Carolina, and I'm descended directly from people who were enslaved in this country. And my great-grandmother, my granny, she spent the first 13 years of her life sharecropping on a small cotton farm in the upstate of South Carolina. And she had a lot of kids, and they had a lot of kids. So I have a really big family with a lot of cousins. And growing up, we would have these big family gatherings. She cooked the best food, and she would tell us stories about her life growing up through sharecropping and segregation during Jim Crow. And I remember hearing her stories, those of my grandparents, and it not matching up with what I was being taught in schools, what was in the textbooks or what was represented in the books that I was getting. And so I've always been interested in that disconnect. It's like, why isn't my family story being represented accurately here? And that history, I later studied history, and specifically the history of social movements. And that is a lot of the information that's being banned as well. And so when I learned about this crisis and thought about the idea of my family story continuing to be banned, and the kinds of stories that bring students into activism, teaches them how to think about race and the causes of racism, that idea was just untenable to me. And so that's a lot of what kind of keeps me going day to day in this. My professional connection. So as Ipek said, I'm a researcher focused on democracy and racial justice here in the US. And the reason this is a democracy issue for us is I think sometimes people will think of these book bans or these attacks on public education as a sort of culture war issue. And we don't see it that way. We see it as very fundamental to what it means to have a functioning and thriving democracy. So we recently this summer, we put out a comprehensive report that was focused on the impacts of these attacks on public education. And in particular, we focus on book bans, but we also put them in a context. And I think one thing I just want to kind of share is book bans are a part of this broader attack on public education. And in my view, there's essentially 4 prongs to it. One is the effort to restrict classroom discussions of race and racism. We've seen this from Florida's version of the Stop Woke Act, but the majority of states now have passed laws that restrict classroom discussions of race and racism, distort the teaching of Black history. And that I really date it back to about 2014 and 2015 when the Black Lives Matter era really started after the killing of Michael Brown, and we were having these public fights over Confederate monuments, right? This was an earlier version of us fighting over how we're going to talk about race, how we're going to talk about our country's history. So there's the attacks on race, there's the attacks on LGBTQ people. Florida has the infamous Don't Say Gay law and the Don't Say They law, which bans pronouns use, bans discussions of sexual orientation and gender identity. But again, a number of states have passed versions of these laws. And so they're kind of being exported. Third is the book bans, states passing laws that make it easier for a person to I was going to say a parent, but a person, you don't have to even be a parent to bring these challenges, to file challenges against books that they consider age inappropriate and remove it for all students. And that age inappropriate is kind of a key word because it's very broad, it's very vague. And so people will use that to basically get rid of books that don't match their ideological project. And then we won't get into this today, but just one fourth that I want to flag for this audience is I think about the attacks on affirmative action and the attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion in universities and in public school programs as a kind of new frontier of this assault on public education. This is taking the gains and the wins of the civil rights movement and kind of turning it against people of color and women and LGBTQ people who have been able to get access to opportunities and education and saying, actually, that's discriminatory. So I think about these all kind of working together. And then you kind of get this storm that we find ourselves in the middle of. So I've been spending the better part of the last year and a half in Florida, meeting with a lot of teachers, students, parents, been from Jacksonville to Tallahassee to Miami. And it's been really wonderful to spend time with people learning about some of these stories. It's also been really harrowing to kind of see how these laws are playing out on the ground. And I'm going to share some of the stories from Florida with us here just in a moment. And I'll just say maybe one last thing about why Florida is important to learn from. This is a national crisis. And as Summer said, these laws are in many, many states. And so some of you might be wondering, okay, what does Florida have to do with me, or why should I care about what happens in Florida? I would say for a couple reasons. The first is that these laws aren't staying there. They're getting exported everywhere. So a part of this assault on public education, there are these conservative think tanks like the Heritage Foundation, where they create basically mock or standard legislation and it gets shipped out to state legislatures all across the country, and state legislators will work to try to push through the most extreme versions of these bills, and kind of through the legislative process. Sometimes you knock off some of the worst effects, and so the bills are less extreme, but the laws that are in Florida are coming to states all over the place. And when you look at the language of these bills, they're oftentimes identical. They're copy and paste. So that's important to know that this could come to your state. And then the second thing at the federal level is that there's been a lot of conversation in the last few months about Project 2025, which was also created by the Heritage Foundation and kind of similar think tanks and actors. And if you read the education section of Project 2025, a lot of what they talk about is this continued attack on public education, but there's a section of it where they literally say, we want to model our national laws and our national changes to the Department of Education based on what's happening in Florida. The person who authored it literally cites to this legislation. And so I've been saying to people, if you want to understand what Project 2025 looks like, go to Florida, go to Texas, go to Alabama, go to South Carolina, where these extreme laws are already in effect, and you can get a sense of what the kind of assault might look like at the national level. So I was in Florida. I was documenting these stories of harm, and what I found when I was there, which I was hoping to kind of find, was this really beautiful resistance movement, people who were fighting back, parents, students, teachers who were saying, we are not going to have this. And I want to just tell you a few of these stories. So I'm going to share my screen. This is just a little bit of a kind of highlight from a web feature we put out, which I'll drop the link to in the chat, and so you all can see it there. 1 second. I think you all should be able to see this now. Okay, I see a couple nods. So what we really wanted to do was say, just as Florida is a blueprint for these terrible laws, it can also be a blueprint for our activist movements in states all across the country. We wanted to spotlight these grassroots organizations. We wanted to change this narrative that Florida is a lost cause, and help these groups recruit people to participate in their efforts. So here are just a few of the folks that we profiled. There are a number of student groups who are phenomenal. I think a lot of times the youth voices don't get included in these movements, but we talked to middle and high school age students who were advocating at the state legislature. We profiled two groups in particular, a group called Florida Student Power, and they're focusing on developing the leadership of Black and Latino youth, specifically in South Florida. And at this photo at the top is one where I went to their state lobby day at the state capitol. And they brought buses where they had dozens of middle and high school age students, and they taught them how to speak to their legislators and how to push back against some of these laws. And this was the last legislative session where there were some more extreme kind of book ban laws being proposed. And, one thing that we've seen is that these efforts by folks to push back at the legislative level don't always work because the legislature has been captured, but it's really powerful for these legislators to have to look in the face of these students and hear that they don't want this for their future, and to know that these are the young people who are going to be coming into leadership in the state and eventually changing things. In the bottom right, this is a picture of Max Fenning, who runs a group called PRISM, and they're an LGBTQ group that's working to get resources to LGBTQ youth all across Florida that talks about their identity. It includes a lot of sexual health information that's being restricted in classrooms. So they're kind of going around the process and saying, let's just reach our people directly. They do a lot of online organizing where a lot of young people are. The educators are fighting back. We talked to teachers who are trying to find different ways to bring things into the curriculum. And even though they're facing these challenges, whether they're part of the teachers union or whether there's a brave teacher, they're trying to do what they know is right. In the bottom right, this is Dr. Marvin Dunn. He's a professor at FIU, but he works with local middle schools and high schools, and he goes to them and he will deliver lectures about Black history. And he also started this program called Teach the Truth Tours, which are tours across the state of Florida. And they go to sites that aren't well known in Florida's history, specifically sites related to the history of slavery, racial violence, the history of lynchings, the history of segregation. And one of the things Dr. Dunn always says that I find just really powerful is that the students, and oftentimes white students and Black students, they say, you know, I'm not angry that, you know, I'm not angry at these people from the past. I'm not angry at my white peers. I'm not angry. There's no sort of resentment that's being built. And if they have any anger, it's that the fact that they didn't know, and this idea that something's being held back from them or that they aren't learning these things. And that really resonated with me and my education. Parents are amazing. They're standing up and fighting back. And I love the stories of the parents because we all know about these groups like Moms for Liberty, and they've really captured national attention. They've gotten a lot of resources and support. And they're often the ones that people turn to when they want to hear parent perspectives. But there are parents who are fighting back. On the right side, this is a woman named Lisette. She runs a group called Moms for Libros, Moms for Books, which I think is a funny kind of retort to Moms for Liberty. But they've been doing amazing work. And Lisette has such a cool story. She grew up, she's a Cuban American, grew up in Miami, and never engaged in activism before. But once these laws passed, these books were banned in Miami. Amanda Gorman's book, The Hill We Climb, the ABCs of Black History. There was a book about Cuban Americans that was banned. And she realized that if this can happen here, it can happen anywhere, and it can come to her kid's school as well. And so she got involved and spoke at a local school board meeting for the first time. She's a very naturally kind of shy person and talked about how much bravery it took for her to do that. And now she started this movement of parents, and she's training parents to learn how to speak to school board members, learn how to speak to state legislatures, to go and kind of figure out ways that they can support teachers who are trying to get this education to the students. This was also one of my favorite stories. I love all the stories. I guess I'm saying that about all of them. This is the faith community. So this is happening all over Florida and all over the country. But on the right, this is Pastor Rhonda Thomas, and she runs an organization called Faith in Florida. And they've started working to reach people at one of the public spaces, or one of the spaces that a lot of people still go to outside of school. And they have two programs in particular. One is that they've created this toolkit that teaches pastors and ministers how to incorporate Black history into their sermons, so that everyone is getting access to this information that's being banned. And then the second thing they do is on Saturdays, they've opened up a kind of renegade like Black history school on Saturdays. And she was telling me that their Saturday schools are now more popular than their Sunday church services. They're open to the community. You don't have to be a member of their church. You don't have to be a Christian to come. And she was saying people of all faiths have been joining in on this movement. And so it's just a really kind of powerful call back to the ways that the church and the faith community have always played an important role in social movements when we needed them to. And then the last one is these cultural institutions. So these are bookstores, libraries, museums, who always play a role in protecting our culture, protecting our history when they're under attack. And they've stepped up. In the top left photo, this is a person named Mitchell Kaplan. He runs a bookstore, or a set of bookstores called Books and Books. And they've sort of acted as an almost sanctuary space for the organizing in the South Florida community around these laws. People kind of go there. If you want to have a gathering to like organize a protest, Books and Books is the place you can go to. They also invite authors of banned books to come speak to the community. They give away free banned books to the young people. And I think that, them and other institutions are playing a really important role in kind of fighting back. And so I think the lesson of all of this, I'll stop sharing here. I think the lesson of all of these stories and all of these people is that you see a couple of things. One is that they're working at all different levels. People are working at the school board, they're working at the school level, they're working at the state capitol. We've worked with some folks on advocacy at the federal government. And so there are all different ways you can be involved. I think particularly in election season, we need to be thinking about all the levels of power and influence that we have. And the second thing is that they're using lots of different tactics. So some of these folks are saying, I want to change the laws. Some of these people are saying, we don't have enough power yet to change the law. So how can we build that power? How can we register enough people to vote so that one day we might shift the legislature? Then some people are saying, while y'all are focused on the laws, today there are kids in our schools who need this information. So how can we get it to them? We can get it to them online. We can get it to them in their church. We can take them on tours to these sites. And ultimately, that's not a solution, right? You have a human right to this information. And so the state and the school should be providing it. So while we're working on that, we want to make sure people are getting it. And then eventually even pushing forward to say that these outside programs that are being created should be a model for what all students get access to in schools. So I think I'll close there and just say that, Florida is not a lost cause. I'm from the South and have done a lot of my work there. And I think people kind of write off the South in general as a lost cause. And I just, this project and many others for me kind of highlight that some of the best organizing and activism comes out of this region, and we can all learn from it. And I think these people in Florida are kind of leading us on a path to liberation. And, they're in the heart of the storm, but it makes you a lot stronger to be in the heart of that storm and find ways to fight back. So hopefully there are some lessons all of us can learn from that. I'll pass back there.
Trey, thank you so much. Oh, how much I appreciate that note at the end, especially, the heart of the storm and the hope can come from that. Thank you for really highlighting that. And thank you also for sharing your personal story, how meaningful it is to hear about it. And all the stories, because when we talk about book bans, often we are just focusing on numbers, right? Number of books, number of school districts, number of states. And as one of the PEN America's reports beautifully puts it, behind all those numbers are deeper stories, which you really beautifully shared with us right now. It's the stories of students whose right to read and learn are denied. It's the stories of the librarians and teachers who are sometimes threatened, assaulted even. Stories of the authors whose works are attacked. And also, which you beautifully shared, the stories of those people who courageously, tirelessly push back, right? They fight for the freedom to read, freedom to learn. They're brave and they're dedicated. And speaking of those brave, dedicated people, I now want to go back to Lawrence Ferlinghetti and this book, The People versus Ferlinghetti. And we have the authors of this beautiful book, Ronald Collins and David Skover, with us today. Such a pleasure to have you. In the book, you call this The True Story of a Maverick American who refused to play it safe and who in the process gave staying power to freedom of the press in America. And to that, I want to really add that this is also a powerful literary, social, political, even psychological portrait of the times. Not just a slice of San Francisco, but also of the nation, of its inner tensions. And the book, I highly recommend it. It's such a great read. The language is bold and electric and poetic at times. It really captures and reflects the language of the times, the Beat generation in a way. So David and Ron will now talk about the book, what inspired them to write it. And it's a relatively recent publication. So can you also please talk to us about how it relates to what's happening today? David, let's go with you first.
Well, thank you very much, Ipek. It is a pleasure for Ron and me to join this distinguished panel for City Light and PEN America's Banned Book Week event. Thanks, Peter, for inviting Ron and me to speak today, and you, Ipek, for moderating this panel and promoting our book. We should hire you. Our appreciation also goes to the audience who, as lovers of liberty, have joined this virtual event to celebrate the American tradition of free speech and press. Ron and I are presenting the story that is told in one of our last co-authored books that Ipek gracefully held up, The People versus Ferlinghetti, The Fight to Publish Allen Ginsberg's Howl. The book was published in 2019, and we were honored to speak first on our book in San Francisco at City Light Bookstore's amazing event to celebrate Lawrence Ferlinghetti's 100th birthday. Ours is a story of a poet bookseller who was prosecuted for selling a poem. In defending his rights of free speech and press against a charge of obscenity under California's penal code, Lawrence Ferlinghetti became a First Amendment hero. The Howl free speech story is really best understood in the obscenity law context of its day. As late as 1942, the US Supreme Court held, in a case named Chaplinsky versus New York, that lewd or obscene publications received no protection at all under the First Amendment. Such expressions were, in the court's view, quote, of slight social value as a step to truth, and were outweighed by the social interest in order and morality. Under this standard, federal and state governments could censor any publication that they considered disgusting, foul, or morally unhealthy. For the next 15 years, obscenity prosecutions turned simply on the statutory and regulatory meanings of obscene expression. But at the very same time that Lawrence Ferlinghetti was publishing Howl, the Supreme Court was revisiting and revising the First Amendment law of obscenity. That 1957 case was Roth versus United States, and the majority opinion in the case was written by Justice William Brennan. The decision was like the Roman god Janus, with two faces, one looking to the past, the other focusing on the future. Brennan's opinion had those two sides. One, the conservative side looking to the past, the other a more libertarian side looking to the future. On the conservative side, the Roth decision reaffirmed that obscenity had no socially redeeming value and thus no First Amendment protection. But on the libertarian side, the opinion distinguished obscenity from mere sexual expression and gave obscenity a highly restrictive definition. The new test: to be obscene, material had to entice lustful desires and have no political, artistic, literary, or scientific value, applying contemporary community standards. So for our story, then, the question eventually would become on which side of this constitutional divide would the poem Howl fall? Only time would tell. Lawrence Monsanto Ferlinghetti was, as Ipek declared, an American maverick. He devoted decades to perfecting the art of freedom writ large as a poet, a painter, a playwright, a book publisher, a bookseller, and a social activist. But the largest part of Ferlinghetti's maverick side was his courage in defending freedom of the press, and at a time when few others did so. It all centered around a poem. Howl was an autobiographical poem. It was composed by a troubled young man, Allen Ginsberg. Allen drew on his experience and the experience of his friends who had lived maddening lives, sometimes in highly destructive ways. I'm going to read just a few excerpts of the Howl poem to give you a sense of the power and of the controversial nature of the Howl poem. I saw the best minds of my generation destroyed by madness. starving, mystical, naked, who dragged themselves through the angry streets at dawn looking for a Negro fix. With those words, Allen aligned his life with his poetry. He was blowing out his experience like a crazy jazz man hopped up on pure, uncut spontaneity. Who poverty and tatters and fantastic minds sat up all night in lofts contemplating jazz. Who bared their brains to heaven under the L and saw Mohammedan angels staggering on tenement roofs illuminated. This was a reference to Bill Canastra, one of the best minds that Allen knew. His flesh became words, agonizing words, in a line that harkened back to Bill's tragic subway death, when in a playful antic, he stuck his head outside the window of a speeding subway car. Now Allen built momentum with repetitive and rhythmic references to whos. He mentioned as well his poor, troubled mother, Naomi, who was never free.
Uh-oh.
I think
Ron's ready to
you're
parachute.
frozen up. Yeah.
I can take over.
If you would, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ron.
So call me David Skover, but I'm also known as Ron Collins. So anyway, the poem is released. Just think of it. Allen Ginsberg writes the poem, all right? But who gets busted? Ferlinghetti, all right? So Lawrence Ferlinghetti decides that he's going to publish this poem and sell the poem. And so he has this series called the Pocket Poet Series, all right? And he's decided that he's going to publish this book. And he had seen the book early on. He knew about the origins of the book. And just consider this. I mean, before this book, Howl was a poem. And here, by the way, I'm channeling David. So I'm going to do my best here. So go back to October 7th, 1955. I mean, what an incredible moment. And there are recordings, not of this, but of similar things that happened. The scene is San Francisco, October 7th, 1955. The place is called Six Gallery, which was a cooperative art gallery situated in what used to be an auto repair shop on Fillmore Street. I mean, just think about that, right? And so other poets were there reading their works. And then on comes Allen Ginsberg, all right? And he gives this incredible Walt Whitman-like rendition of a poem. People like Jack Kerouac are there drinking from, a big wine bottle. And as the book, I mean, you really have to listen to Howl, because when you listen to it, it jumps from the page and enters your consciousness. And so to be there and feel that rhythm of the poem build and build and build, and with the audience swaying, as the rhythm of Ginsberg's poem begins, Ferlinghetti is completely taken. I mean, he just says, I want this, okay? And so he writes, echoing Ralph Waldo Emerson's response to Walt Whitman's Leaf of Grass. He sends him a telegram. Ferlinghetti sends Allen Ginsberg a telegram. I greet you at the beginning of a great career. When do I get the manuscript? All right. So, well, let's move from there. Had Ferlinghetti read the manuscript? Yes. Had he heard it? Yes. By the way, this isn't just some manuscript of a poem with some dirty words. This essentially, among other things, is Allen Ginsberg outing himself. This is 1957. Even in San Francisco, and particularly in San Francisco in 57, it's a very conservative place. outing yourself could not only meant, social condemnation. I mean, it meant in certain instances you could even get arrested, right? Nevertheless, Ferlinghetti decides to publish the poem. But Lawrence, what I loved about Ferlinghetti, and we did have a chance to interview the man, an acquired taste for sure, but we love that taste. And he kind of a no-nonsense kind of poet. I mean, where Ginsberg and all these others were kind of way out there was something on the pragmatic side, if you will, pragmatic/poetic with him. So he realizes that publishing this poem could be problematic. So he gets a foreign publisher. He gets a publisher in London to publish it. And the publisher decides to put in asterisks where all the dirty words were, quote unquote dirty words, because custom officials knew about this publisher. They had come after him once for a magazine he published called Miscellaneous Man. So they decided they were going to seize the books. I mean, even with asterisks, customs officials seized the books. But of course, he prevails on that, but then decides, and this tells you something about the man. Lawrence Ferlinghetti never saw a fight that he wasn't willing to engage in, all right? So he decides he's going to publish this book in the United States, but he's going to delete the asterisks, all right? Before William Brennan used the words uninhibited, robust, and wide open, Lawrence Ferlinghetti gave them meaning, all right? He said, this is the poet's message, and we are publishing it as the poet wrote it. Well, wouldn't you know it, there's a quote-unquote sting operation. I mean, you can believe it. San Francisco police from the juvenile department of the San Francisco police, they decide they're going to do a raid. So they have undercover officers go there, and they look at it, what have you. And at the time, Ferlinghetti is at Big Sur at his beach home there. So they arrest the store manager, Shigeyoshi Muro. And I think about this. This guy is the manager of the bookstore, and he's being arrested for a poem that Allen Ginsberg wrote and Lawrence Ferlinghetti published. He just works there. Anyway, in time, they will also arrest Lawrence Ferlinghetti. And at the time, the San Francisco Chronicle, and this tells you the importance of freedom of the press, they publish a cartoon mocking, all right, what the San Francisco police did. And the cartoon, in part, had a police officer nailing a message on the front of a door of City Lights. And it said, all books must be fit for children to read. All books must be fit. As for Ferlinghetti, is he worried about going to jail? No, he says it's a good opportunity for him to spend some time reading poetry. And what does he do? What is this map? I just love this guy. I mean, he's the embodiment of free speech, all right? What does he do? He tells the staff the next day to fill the window with copies of Howl, right? Bring it on, right? And he said, mano y mano, I'm willing to go the rounds with you guys. And so the story begins. Now, how does the story begin? This book was too easy to read. I mean, it was like, it was meant, somebody just had to come and pick it up. Who's the judge? They decide they're not going to have a jury trial, all right? He's going to have a judge. And who's the judge that he picks? Judge Clayton Horn. This is a Sunday school preacher, right? This is a judge who had some women in his courtroom for shoplifting. And what is the sentence he imposes on them? They have to watch the 10 Commandments and then come back to court and write a short essay as to what it meant to them. I mean, would anybody have ever thought in 1,000 years that this judge is going to be sympathetic to you? I don't think so. Well, enter the ACLU. We're going to get back to Judge Horn in a moment. But enter the ACLU team and a guy named Jake Ehrlich, never plead guilty Jake Ehrlich, high-end lawyer, wore all sorts of fancy suits, fancy boots, represented a lot of important clients and movie stars and what have you. And he was doing this pro bono probably for the publicity. But still, he was a renowned lawyer. Entered the ACLU team working with him, Lawrence Spicer, the director of the National ACLU of the Northern California chapter of the ACLU. He brings together all the defense witnesses, which are incredible. By the way, at the same time he's arguing this case, he's arguing a case on his own behalf, where he's the defendant in the United States Supreme Court. All right, he will win that case. Moving along, though, as a part of that team, it's just an incredible lineup of lawyers and what have you. And one of them is a young ACLU lawyer named Al Bendick. Oh my God, a guy, he's brand new, he just cut his teeth on this case, and he writes this memo that is unbelievable. Just had really kind of brought everything together. And guess what? Judge Clayton Horn reads this and is impressed by it. He's moved by it. He actually follows the law and renders an opinion finding the defendants not guilty, all right, largely on the work of Al Bendick, all right, again, a great civil liberties hero. And so you have this Sunday school teacher, all right, who is the last person you would have thought was going to render the kind of verdict that he does. And that opinion, which had never been published, we published as an appendix, really is an absolutely incredible opinion. This is a municipal judge. This is a judge that hears traffic violations, right? He doesn't write opinions. But in this case, he did. The opinion was never published, and we're pleased and honored to publish it as an appendix to our book. So let me just close with this, with the words from the man, and that's our poet friend. Even after Howl was found, remember Howl, it's an opinion by a municipal judge. So it only applies to a very limited area. It doesn't even apply to a whole county or a whole state, let alone the nation. But Howl after that wasn't prosecuted anywhere. I mean, somehow, and it also became censorship. And Summer and Trey, you might, among all of you might find it interesting. What put Howl on the map was censorship, right? I mean, that's what blew it up in ways that the best thing that could have ever happened to Allen Ginsberg was this prosecution. It was the absolute best thing that ever happened to him. But moving forward, and I'm going to get to our poet, I want to end with some words from Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Pity the Nation, unbelievable poem. And by the way, a shout out for that book on dissent. If you never read another book on dissent, read Lawrence Ferlinghetti's book. It's just such a precious book. And thank you, Ipek, for mentioning it. I was moved just hearing the words at the outset. But in any event, could you read Howl on broadcast, radio or TV? No, FCC versus Pacifica, it's illegal to do. You could, if anybody was willing to do it on the internet. And so we tried to, working with Lawrence, we tried to get Pacifica Radio to read the poem on broadcast radio. $300,000 for each word that was obscene, quote unquote, or indecent, I should say. So they passed on that. But they read the book. They read the poem on internet radio. But even to this day, ask yourself, could any school dare treat to have this book in their library? I mean, one of the great American poems, one of the poems that stands at the forefront of gay liberation. Would any library be able to have this book today? I think not. With that, and I'm a little confused about David's time and my time, so let me just close with these words from the man. And they're from a poem that he wrote called Pity the Nation. And I'm just turning to it now. And here he is. So Lawrence Ferlinghetti, Pity the Nation. Pity the nation whose people are sheep and whose shepherds mislead them. Pity the nation whose leaders are liars, whose sages are silenced. And then, echoing the words of Walt Whitman, he closes, Pity the nation, oh, pity the people who allow their rights to erode and their freedoms to be washed away. My country, tears of thee, sweet land of liberty. Does it get any better than that? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ron, and David as well. I'm sorry we missed you towards the middle, but this was, you know, Ron, your passion is contagious, really, right now. I'm bursting with so many questions. We will make time for questions for the audience as well, but I have to first jump in and do a few follow-up questions about coming from Howl to looking at what's really happening right now, back to now, again, Howl to now. In the book, you write, Howl was a rant against racism, right? Sexual moralism, authoritarianism, capitalism, materialism. And Howl had redeeming social importance. That was the verdict. That was the verdict at the end of the trial. So important to think of that, redeeming social importance. So when we think about the books that are being banned right now, I would love to hear all of your thoughts on those books redeeming social importance, their cultural, and I also want to say psychological importance too, because we're talking about students, young minds, and mental health crisis. So would love to hear everyone's thoughts, whoever wants to jump in.
If I could just at the start kind of echo something that Trey and Summer said, and I think it is implicit in and also explicit, Ipek, in some of the things you've said. I've just finished a book on Emmett Till and the Emmett Till trial of 1955. I've been talking to people in Mississippi. Do you know that right now in Mississippi, all right, it is not clear, it is unclear whether or not books, library books for children can talk about the brutal murder of Emmett Till. Why? Because under Mississippi law, such books involving cruelty and violence harmful to children can be banned. So it's not even, this is in Mississippi, goddamn. And by the way, there's a song called Mississippi, goddamn. If you haven't heard it, it's a great song. But this is in Mississippi. It's not even clear that the Mississippi tragedy can be taught in Mississippi and used in by library books because they're, quote, harmful or violent to children, all right? And of course that, you remember the open casket funeral there. So when we talk about social redeeming value, it all goes back to truth. How truthful do you want to be, all right? And if you see the truth as harmful to you or to your opinions or to your views, all right, which kind of goes to the whole question, Ipek, that you talked about democracy, then the answer is simple. No, that has to be censored. And I think I'm so glad that people, that groups like PEN and FIRE, for whom I do some work as well, are fighting that battle, because I think, as Summer pointed out, more than ever, it is a battle that needs to be fought and needs to be fought with vigor. And so I'm just delighted, Trey, to be here with you and Summer in this campaign. And I applaud you for the work you're doing. And you're absolutely right, Summer. We need this fight now more than ever. And I only wish Lawrence Ferlinghetti were here, you know, to carry the flag into the battlegrounds.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to add a little bit, and I'd love to hear from Trey too. I mean, I think, you know, I mean, fundamentally, these book bans are about silencing, right? And they're about silencing voices that have traditionally been silenced. I mean, this language of obscenity to target queer LGBTQ voices throughout history, right? We have seen this time and time again to silence these stories, to keep these people out of, you know, kind of our culture and our society in a meaningful way. And I think, you know, that's part of what's particularly heartbreaking, I think, about this moment, is that it's because we started to see more representation of these voices. We started to see more children's books that were reckoning with these complications, these truths of American history that have been denied for a long time, representing these different stories and perspectives. And now we're seeing backlash against it. I think that's part of what's, you know, particularly painful to kind of see the deep social value of having these stories be present, how much that means to children to see their stories, to see their family's history, to see their own experience of reckoning with racism, of reckoning with their own gender and sexuality, and to know they're not alone. We constantly hear from writers that they hear from parents and children that these books save people's lives, and to lose access to that, and to lose access to the ability to better understand people who are different from us through stories as well, is deeply tragic, but it's also very deliberate. And that's, I think we also as PEN, we're working on these issues internationally too. And so we know this is also just a tactic of authoritarianism. This is, something we've seen as part of Nazi Germany and apartheid South Africa and Putin's Russia, and and this broader sort of attack on public education, on the educational sphere as a part of an attack on democracy is also, something we've seen under Orban in Hungary and Bolsonaro in Brazil. And so, these are bigger trends, I think, that often we don't fully recognize for what they really are as well. And so I think there's, the fight back against this is very much about the books and the stories and their individual value, but it's also, as Trey said as well, it's really about the fundamentals of defending our democracy.
Yeah, I agree, Summer, and Ron both. I'll just add briefly one book that kind of comes to mind that is one of my favorite books. Toni Morrison's one of my favorite authors, and Bluest Eyes, you mentioned earlier, Summer, is like at the top of all of these lists. And so the idea that something that's so foundational to me and so many other people is being denied is just really frustrating. And I think one of the kind of cost of these attacks, or that and specifically the kind of banning of books around Black history, kind of discussions about systemic racism, is that it's about promoting this idea that kind of racism or racial difference is natural in our society. So, for example, if you're a kid and you grow up in a poor Black community, and you're experiencing housing insecurity and sort of disinvestment in your community, you have environmental injustices. If you aren't given access to information that teaches you about the history of laws and sort of social structures that created those conditions, you think something's wrong with you, or you think something's wrong with your family or with your community. And I think that that's also a part of the kind of political project that we're up against, is they're saying, you won't vote for an anti-racist candidate if you don't know that racism exists. And so it really is about sort of distorting people's worldview in order to maintain power. So I think that that's important. And the way they talk about them, a lot of these laws sort of talk about banning divisive concepts, but it's divisive for whom? Who decided that they were divisive? And that's what's used to get rid of a lot of these books. And I think one other thing that kind of comes to mind with this is it's just really distressing how this recent wave of laws has there's always been these assaults on books, and they've even made their way into the government, but I think they've made their way to the highest levels in this latest wave, seeing governors, state legislators take them on, but even at the highest level. So I remember at the end of the last presidential administration, there was an executive order signed that created the 1776 Commission that sort of talked about U.S. history in a particular ideological way, and there was a ban with it throughout the federal agencies on talking about diversity, equity, or inclusion. So what does it mean that from the highest levels of government, we're banning certain ideas from being taught? And I guess just to add, these laws, the book challenge laws, almost create this sort of vigilante system where just random people all across the place are encouraged to turn against their neighbors, turn against their schools, and bring forward these challenges. And so if you go to these school board meetings and you just see the ways that neighbors are being turned against one another, being turned against their teachers in their schools, it's particularly concerning. And I think that you can sit in some of these meetings and just see people who are objecting to these books really enraged and shouting. And I kind of wonder, you really have been sold this idea, and it's been planted so deep, but it's just really sad to me that they're being taught to turn against their neighbors and people who are different than them in this way, and they're empowered by the state. They have a tool to kind of implement their view over everyone else. So I guess I went away from your original question, but this latest wave does feel especially dangerous. And like Summer said, we're seeing these laws escalate and spread more and more across the country.
Ipek, if I could just add one quick point.
Absolutely.
The First Amendment is not just about what lawyers and judges do. It's what the people do with it. And I think one of the things about Lawrence Ferlinghetti and the story is that he engaged in what was called creative activism, right? And I think that sort of creative activism, the same kind that maybe Till had when in 1955 she had an open casket funeral. And, and that story, there had been 500 lynchings in Mississippi that had gone unnoticed for decades and decades. And it wasn't until that woman had this open casket funeral. And what was that? That was essentially symbolic speech, all right? And so this sort of creative activism, which I think is entirely consistent with what Lawrence Ferlinghetti did. I love that moment when he put the books in the bookshelf, the book in the window of the bookshop and said, "Bring it on." And I think it's so important to think that what people do in creative ways is also so important to preserving our First Amendment freedoms.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm incredibly grateful to have such a robust, dynamic, and impressive panel today. I mean, I feel like we can go on for hours, but we can't. I have to be mindful of time, but there are a few things I still want to ask. And before I ask them, this conversation with Trey and Ron now, there's a quote, actually, this is not a question, a quote I would like to share from former US Supreme Court Associate Justice Potter Stewart, who once said, "Censorship reflects a society's lack of confidence in itself." Mm-hmm. I find that so thought-provoking. And we could go with that and then be here for another 4 hours, of course, but I want to go back to the book bans right now and activism right now. And this comes from PEN America's report, Banned in the USA, Narrating the Crisis. The report says, even in the face of extreme state laws, hateful rhetoric, and an extraordinary number of bans, the fight for the freedom to read has never been stronger. And I think Trey's presentation, Human Rights Watch's work, demonstrated this very powerfully, the counter movement, right? And I find that really heartening. And I would love to hear your thoughts on there's so many wonderful examples that Human Rights Watch put forth for us to all look at. What moves you the most, and what do you think you would like to see more of? What's going to move the needle?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, all of those stories are really moving. And I guess one thing that I've been thinking about is the conditions under which these people are organizing. It's not just the knowing that the state government is pushing forward this rhetoric that's against you, but we have stories that we document in the report of people facing literal threats of violence. We talked to a school board member who is a mom, and she was voting against these book challenge laws. She was voting to be more inclusive of LGBTQ people in schools, and people started protesting at her home. There were people who vandalized her home. They messed with her bushes, and they were chanting outside of her house. There's a really powerful story where she's reading to her daughter at bedtime, and these people are chanting outside, and her daughter's 8 years old, and it's like, what's going on out there? We talked to teenagers who showed up at school board meetings, and in the back of the room were Proud Boys and armed white supremacist groups who are there to support these people kind of trying to implement these ideas. And so the stakes are really high on the ground. And so the fact that people are still showing up in spite of that is, I think, a lesson we can all learn from. I think one thing that all of us can do, whether we're in one of these states where these laws are in place or not, I mean, eventually we're going to need to get power in state legislatures. Like it's become a political issue. But I think one thing that I've been spending time the last few months really pushing on and in conversation about is the role of the federal government. The federal government under this administration has largely left these issues to the state, saying, it's a state issue. But we argue that it's not, and that there is a model for the Department of Education, the Department of Justice, the White House to take a more active role in preventing these sorts of messages from spreading across the country. The Department of Education and the Department of Justice, they have a civil rights complaints process. And so we've been encouraging more and more people to file those complaints. You don't have to sign up to be a plaintiff in a lawsuit, which can be very time consuming. It can be very complex. And for a lot of reasons, people might not sort of feel that they want to take on that responsibility, but they can file a complaint with the Department of Education. We've been sort of advocating for them to be more transparent about that process and to really look into these issues. These agencies have the power to go and investigate these states and these school districts where these laws are really extreme and where we're seeing a really high sort of concentration of discrimination and hostile environments. And then just, asking for our federal government, whether you're voting for Congress or Senate or at the state level, making sure that the people you're voting for are really vocal about these issues, because I think a lot of people have kind of run away from this and they said, we don't want to talk about this, it's too controversial, but we have to take it head on. And I think encouraging your candidates to do that in an election year is something that all of us can do and need to be doing more of. There's a couple of pieces of federal legislation that have been proposed, one around one's called like the Book Saves Lives Act, that sort of by Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley out of Massachusetts. And it's a really important step, sort of mandating the diversity of perspectives and lived experiences in books. And so encouraging people to sign on to that is one step I think that people can take. So whether you're in these states or not, there's a role all of us can be playing, because this is a national crisis that's going to impact all of us.
Well said, Trey. Thank you. Summer, anything you want to add?
I certainly share Trey's sentiment in terms of how impressive it is to see people stand up despite the threats and dangers that they're facing, which are very real. And I think especially, students and parents who didn't really sign up for this, but are taking it up and really making their voices heard is very powerful. I think it's really important that everybody make their voices heard at the local level as well. Go to your school board meeting. This is, as I said, this is a very vocal minority. It is, the vast majority of Americans oppose book bans, and yet this movement is spreading because this vocal minority is very effective and is managing to be louder. But I think everybody else needs to make their voices heard as well, and to make clear that they value having these books in their school libraries and as part of their educational system, that they want these voices to be present, these stories to be present. And I think, school districts are under a lot of pressure, and I recognize the challenges that they're facing. So they need to hear, from the folks on the other side as well, definitely.
Thank you, Summer. Thank you so much. This is going to be my last question, and then for a few minutes only, I'll be able to get a question from the audience, hopefully. What does the future look like for free speech and books, you think, in the US? Are we headed towards a more restrictive environment, you think, or fear, or a greater freedom of expression? It's a hard one.
I always say, if you're going to do this work, you have to be an optimist at heart. And I think I am. So, I will always believe that freedom of expression and the power of literature and stories is going to win the day, because I think that, over time and over history, it typically has. But we also know these fights can be brutal. And we know that, the efforts to attack freedom of expression, to attack our education system are strong and well coordinated. And they've been very effective. And so, I think I anticipate that this fight will continue. Again, we had hoped, as much as I love doing these, I wish, we weren't having to have this conversation every year. I wish that the numbers would go down and this trend would reverse itself, but that's certainly not what we're seeing right now. So, I think as long as many of us stay really committed and engaged, I do have hope in the long term, but I think it's going to be a fight for sure.
There's the law of free speech, and then there's the culture of free speech, and those aren't necessarily the same. And quite often, or maybe not often enough, the culture of free speech exceeds the law of free speech. In terms of the Roberts Court, and despite all of the celebration about it's the most First Amendment court ever, it's the most First Amendment court for the powerful. But it's not clear that it's always the most protective of First Amendment rights for the powerless. On the question that we've been talking about in terms of censorship of books in libraries and schools, it's not really clear how these great defenders in the Roberts Court would come down on some of these issues. I also say to the lawyers out there, I'm shocked at how often state constitutional claims are not raised in these cases. And as we've seen in the abortion context, sometimes those claims can prevail. And so although I'm much more of an activist than I am a litigator, I still think that's an opportunity that's missed. But again, as I said, I think social activism is really important. I think the culture of free speech. I think as Summers mentioned, that the vast majority of Americans are opposed to bans on books. And so how do you translate that into some social protest, activity? All right, what's the mindset for doing that? And as I said, I just thought that some of the examples of symbolic speech we've seen over the years can just show how the needle of free speech, in terms of the culture of free speech, can be moved.
Thank you, Ron.
Yeah.
Trey.
It's a great question. I feel like it haunts me. I think about that all the time. Like, where are we going? I think one thing that kind of gives me hope is that I read this wave of laws as a sign that our movement is winning. We have more and more books being published by authors of color, more and more books being published by LGBTQ people, extremely representative children's books. 2020, a lot of these laws, as Summer mentioned, were passed as a backlash to the summer of 2020, one of the largest protest movements in world history, one of the largest movements for racial justice and understanding systemic injustice. And if you remember what was happening that summer, so many people were turning to books. They were starting book clubs, they were reading with each other, they were learning and discussion. And so I think these laws were a sign of, oh, shoot, we're scared. And it's a sign of sort of a desperate grip for power. And it makes me think, oh, yeah, we're winning. Like, we must be very powerful for this backlash to be as intense as it is. And one thing I've been talking to our team a lot about is just how this is a moment in history where we see echoes of things that have happened in the past, democracy, and whenever democracy's been expanded, there's always been alongside it this fight for education. If we think about the end of slavery, in this period of Reconstruction, the very first thing formerly enslaved Black people did once they got their freedom after the Civil War was they said, we want to start schools. They started public education and established that throughout the South. And this idea that educating people was one of the most important things we could do in order to protect democracy. And then 100 years later, before the Voting Rights Act passed, we have activism like Freedom Summer, where people were starting up these freedom schools all throughout the South and teaching people who had been disenfranchised how to read, how to engage in local politics. They were teaching them about kind of Black history. And so they were educating them. And then we eventually get the passage of the Voting Rights Act, and you have this educated, informed public. And I think about those moments as being really inspiring and kind of understanding that information, that free speech goes right alongside having a strong democracy. And I think we're in another one of those moments right now. The future, we'll be freer if we make it. So I guess it's up to us. Yeah. And I believe we can, but it's up to us, and it's not guaranteed.
Thank you for sharing your inspiration, because I find that all of you, everything I've heard right now, to me, it's so important because you shared your optimism, but in a very realistic tone. Like this is our responsibility, our social responsibility. It can happen, but it's up to us. Thank you for that. In terms of questions, I see one question from the audience, and that is the quote I shared earlier, former US Supreme Court Associate Justice Potter Stewart. The quote is, "Censorship reflects a society's lack of confidence in itself." So I'm going to repeat that. And since we don't have any other questions and we're at time, I'm going to bring it to a close by, first of all, a huge thank you to all the participants. What a rich conversation. Thank you. And I also want to say, as we're closing, this week, Banned Books Week, is not just about censorship, just about repression. As I said it earlier, and it's worth repeating, this is also a time to really acknowledge and celebrate the great and deeply meaningful efforts of all those librarians and teachers and students and parents and activists, community members, organizations, big and small, who work for the freedom, stand up, speak up for the freedom to read, freedom to learn. It's about celebrating their diligence, dedication, their courage, and their resilience. And you all are doing that. So Summer, Trey, Ron, David, thank you so much for everything you've done. Thank you for sharing your about your experience and words of wisdom with us. It's been an honor to have you here with us today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.